regional stability to be outlined in the Defence Strategic Review to be made public tomorrow.
It's an incredibly important piece of work because what it seeks to do is really restate Australia's strategic posture for the first time in more than 35 years.
SBS can reveal the report will make more than 100 recommendations on how Australia's Defence Force should adapt to meet the challenges of a changing strategic environment, change largely being driven by China.
This is not just about trade across the South China Sea, it's about blackmail, cajoling, about threatening in the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean.
Despite slashing funding to some programs, the defence budget is projected to rise to 2.2% of GDP and could grow further.
We have to balance all of these different pressures, whether it's defence, health, all the investments in Medicare that have a cost of living focus.
The Defence Review outlining a $42 billion budget black hole, with defence projects announced under the coalition not costed. The Liberals defending their record as the party that secured AUKUS, looking forward to the review's findings.
And political correspondent Sarah Tomevska joins us now from Canberra. Good evening, Sarah. Now, this Defence Strategic Review is due to be released tomorrow, but why is it so significant?
Good evening, Janice. Well, this is the first wholesale review of Australia's Defence Force in more than 35 years, and it will shape the direction of Australia's entire defence strategy for the decades to come. The review was first handed to the government by the Chief of the Defence Force back in February, and it will finally be made public tomorrow, albeit a declassified version. We know the review will make 108 recommendations. SBS understands most of those will be made public. Some will be kept a secret for national security reasons. We also expect the report will take into account China's rising influence in the region. The Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has already alluded to a focus on long-range projection and a sea-based defence strategy. One thing that defence analysts I've spoken to today have also pointed out could be in the report is, for the first time, a focus on climate change as it relates to defence, pointing out that catastrophic weather events pose a real risk to global supply and food chains. Janice.
Thanks so much. That's political reporter.
Tonight, a major defence overhaul. A new focus on missile technology with a warning geography won't save Australia.
We confront the most challenging strategic circumstances since the Second World War.
Good evening, Lydia Feng with ABC News. Australia will leap into a new missile age. It's part of a sweeping shake-up of the military, overhauling the army with a focus on protecting the nation's north. A major review has found there's only a remote chance of invasion, but immediate action is needed to deter other urgent threats. Defence correspondent Andrew Green begins our coverage.
8 months since its commissioning.
We're here today to launch the Defence Strategic Review.
A 110-page document begins a historic reshaping of the ADF.
It is the most significant work that's been done since the Second World War.
The declassified National Defence Report spells out the risks posed by China's rapid militarisation, nominating 6 priority areas. Nuclear-powered submarines remain the top focus, along with developing long-range missile capability. The review calls for renewed efforts to attract and retain defence personnel, as well as deepening diplomatic and defence partnerships across the region, harnessing new disruptive technologies more rapidly into ADF capability, and hardening key defence bases across northern Australia with more personnel and equipment stationed there.
All of this is a watershed moment for defence policy in our country's history.
The federal government is spending $19 billion in its immediate response to the review. That's paid for in part by $7.8 billion in cuts or tweaks to existing defence programs. Infantry fighting vehicles and mobile artillery weapons among those to be scaled back.
There will be a need for defence expenditure to increase above that which had previously been budgeted for. We make no apologies for that.
Today's announcement on the eve of Anzac Day is tricky politics.
Army's focus instead turns to long-range land-based strike missiles. But decisions on the future of Navy's warships will be subject to another short review, led by a retired US Admiral.
Defence acquisition must speed up. We must also embrace more risk in that process.
When we say defence needs to accept more risk, that means that all of us have to accept more risk as well.
Debate over funding will rage, but this review won't fire up any party political argument over the underlying need to arm up. Using words like urgent, the Albanese government's outlook is strikingly similar to its predecessors. That is, that distance and time can no longer be relied upon to protect this continent. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
China's foreign ministry this afternoon insisted Beijing doesn't pose a threat to any country. But as political editor Andrew Probert explains, such assurances don't resonate in Canberra.
China's mentioned just 9 times in the published Defence Strategic Review, yet Xi Jinping's been the biggest influence on Australia's new military settings. The Chinese president's assertiveness and his territorial ambition have forced this reconfiguration, as well as the worrying conclusion that our defence capabilities aren't enough to serve as a deterrent against high-level threats. That's the paradox at the heart of the Strategic Review. It recommends an urgent increase in Australia's armaments, not to prepare for conflict, but to avoid it. And while the security alliance with the United States remains critical to Australia's self-defence, the aim is to discourage potential aggressors from taking the risk. This is the reality in the defence shake-up. Australia has to effectively muscle up against its biggest trading partner in the risky calculation that it's the best way to preserve regional peace.
The military threat posed by China has prompted a dramatic review of the nation's defences. It's recommending a fundamental overhaul of Australia's approach to deal with the urgent risk of conflict. The Albanese government commissioned the review and has agreed to many of the recommendations. They've now been publicly unveiled, including a major investment in long-range missiles.
Propelling the nation into the missile age as Labor releases a declassified version of the Defence Strategic Review.
This represents a document for today and tomorrow.
The 110-page report undertaken by former Defence Minister Stephen Smith and former Defence Chief Sir Angus Houston provides a sense of urgency, finding the Defence Force is not ready to deal with the increased threat of conflict in the region as a result of China's massive military build-up.
In the circumstances that we now face, that defence posture is no longer fit for purpose.
Focusing on 6 priority areas, including the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines and larger missile strike range. In order to pay for the new approach, dozens of existing defence programs will be shrunk, delayed or scrapped altogether. As foreshadowed, the planned 450 infantry fighting vehicles to replace Vietnam War-era transport will be reduced to just 129. The second phase of the multi-billion-dollar project for self-propelled howitzers to be built in Australia has been dumped. Overall, cuts would save $7.8 billion, $19 billion to be spent over the next 4 years. Spending in defence will increase to over 2% of GDP.
That's not easy to do. It's not easy to do with the structures and the processes and the organisations that Defence has in place right now. So it's going to have to break some things to get after that.
Already the subject of a political stoush.
The mission is clear. We must respond to our strategic circumstances. Yet we haven't seen a strategy. There is no new money. and we're cannibalising capability.
This is not about defending Australia. This is about joining the United States and the United States military to threaten and project force against China.
Instead, the funds will be focused on bolstering the nation's northern defences with more infrastructure and critically long-range missile development. At the moment, there is air and sea launch capability to a maximum of about 200 kilometres. The government wants to see that reach dramatically increased to up to 1,000 kilometres.
We are recasting the mission of the Australian Defence Force.
What's abundantly clear from this review, the luxury of time no longer exists. Once a 10-year warning sign of potential conflict, now reduced to years, even months. It also underlines China's growing assertion of sovereignty in the South China Sea.
The massive military build-up is designed to intimidate, to scare, cajole, blackmail and pressure.
We cannot fall back on old assumptions. We must build and strengthen our security by seeking to shape the future rather than waiting for the future to shape us.
A new focus for the defence of the nation, sharpened by developments well beyond Australia's shores. Pablo Vinales, SBS World News.
Let's go to Canberra now and bring in our chief political correspondent, Anna Henderson, for more analysis on this announcement. Good evening, Anna. How will this change the way the Army operates, and just how difficult will the task of recruitment be?
Well, Janice, the Army has been bracing for this review to come out, and in the lead up there was some suggestion that the way it operates would be significantly changed. Certainly some of those big changes to the spending footprint and the focus on missiles will have an impact, but some of the defence analysts I spoke to today said it wasn't as extreme as they'd been expecting. But of course, the process now of recruiting people to join the military is the big challenge for the government. Over the next decade, at least 10,000 additional people need to be attracted to work for defence, and the mental health impacts of deployment are now well established. The Defence Minister acknowledges this is going to be a hard environment to recruit in. At the same time, Janice, there's still a lot of this review that we just don't have any visibility on because half of this document remains classified. So in terms of understanding just the full nature of what the government plans to do, at this point it's impossible to know all the detail.
And Anna, we've seen the Defence Forces increasingly engaged in assisting with climate change emergency responses. Does this review address whether that should continue?
So in the past, we have seen in recent years horrendous emergencies, the Black Summer bushfires, cyclones and floods, where the ADF has been called in on an emergency scale to help in the immediate aftermath and then in the longer term in terms of even rebuilding. What this review says is that the Defence Forces should only be used in extreme circumstances. So that leaves a big gap because Labor did campaign to win government on being the party that was able to be the emergency management master, really. So whatever is going to happen in terms of standing up some kind of disaster management force, it appears the Australian Defence Force won't be as involved as they have been in the past. But we were told by the Prime Minister today that we had to wait. He couldn't announce all the things that he wanted to on the same day, but expect around the budget there might be more detail on that. One of the other things which wasn't in this review was any mention of Taiwan, the major flashpoint for Australia's relationship with China. Perhaps it was in the classified element, but at this point it wasn't there publicly. We know that the Australian government has today briefed 30 countries about the contents of this review, and that there were Chinese officials who were involved in that process. But later this year, the Prime Minister was expected to potentially travel to Beijing to repair $20 billion in trade ties. What impact this review might have on the relationship with China, we'll have to really wait and see. But certainly with the budget soon approaching and international trade a big factor in our coffers, the cost of peace in the region, Janice, is really still being counted.
Thanks so much for that update. That's Chief Political Correspondent Anna Henderson with analysis on the government's defence overhaul.
The Defence Review aims to reshape the nation's military over the coming decade against the backdrop of an assertive China in contest for regional power with the US. Shortly I'll be talking to the Defence Minister, but first here's Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle.
the single most important re-evaluation of Australia's strategic posture in the last 35 years.
A blueprint for sweeping overhauls of programs and weaponry.
They're looking to get new stuff in what is for defence a pretty quick time frame.
We should want to increase the questions that reside in Xi Jinping's mind before he decides to roll the dice in a horrible way.
A bit like the AUKUS announcement a few weeks ago, there was a fair bit of hype in the language used to foreshadow the Defence Strategic Review released today.
We confront the most challenging strategic circumstances since the Second World War, both in our region and indeed around the world. The scale and significance of the Defence Strategic Review and my government's response shows the strength of our determination to keep Australians safe.
But unlike the AUKUS announcement with its forecast mega spend of at least $270 billion, today's announcement was curiously lacking in numbers. We are about to make an immediate and major investment in guided weapons and missiles, according to the review, as part of a realignment of our defence forces to deal with those challenging strategic circumstances, things we can shoot at people from a long way away. But like a lot of other statements in the review, just how we go about that and why has a lot of experts stumped.
It's unlikely that we will be able to be successful in getting what we need in terms of the quantity and the quality and the manufacturing ability domestically to do that. The war in Ukraine has depleted stocks of many of the precision-guided munitions that the United States was where we turned to supply them from. Many countries now want them. And for Australia to actually boost its very limited stocks of these weapons and munitions, we're going to have to seriously double down on getting licensed versions manufactured locally.
It's perfectly viable for Australia to manufacture missiles to designs developed by other people, importing a whole lot of components from other people. The question then is, what does that do for us? How much does it really enhance our strategic autonomy and capacity?
The focus on missiles reflects a sense of urgency in the review, which says that in a missile age, we can no longer rely on our geography to give us warning time of a conflict. We no longer have a 10-year warning, and there are things we must do in the next 3 years. The threat is not of invasion, but of, quote, major conflicts that threaten our national interest. That includes everything from a conflict in the region like Taiwan, to incursions into our economic interests on the Northwest Shelf.
Nothing envisaged by this Defence Strategic Review materially increases our capacity to make a substantial contribution to a US-led coalition defending Taiwan, nor does it do anything to enhance deterrence of China, which is what the government keeps on talking about. If they're really serious about deterring China, then they're going to have to do a lot more, a lot faster than they're yet even beginning to contemplate.
Missiles might be at the centre of the plan, but that makes the review's scathing criticism of the organisation whose job it is to buy guided weapons and missiles that much more disconcerting. The review says that this organisation
lacks available financial resources over this decade and lacks the required workforce. It is yet to produce a strategy.
In addition to the people shortages, there's the age-old problem of how defence goes about buying equipment. The review says
the system needs to abandon its pursuit of the perfect solution or process and focus on delivering timely and relevant capability. It must be based on minimum viable capacity in the shortest possible time.
The US alliance, the review says, is becoming, quote, even more important to Australia and proposes increased US forces presence in Australia and the region. This is despite the review noting the United States is no longer the uncontested leader of the Indo-Pacific and makes clear, quote, China's military build-up is occurring without transparency or reassurance to the Indo-Pacific region of China's strategic intent. This is unlikely to please the government's chief critic.
We are now part of a containment policy against China.
I think there's a political tension inside the Labor Party that reflects the Keating blowback, if you like, and that has generated a tension between what they feel they can fund and what they recognise the nation needs.
The review emphasises the role of defence bases, ports and barracks in Australia's north, and says that long recommended but neglected upgrades, such as lengthening and strengthening runways, have to take place. The review says the Defence of Australia doctrine, outlined in the 1986 DIB review and which focused on defending the Australian mainland, is no longer fit for purpose. It says it needs to be replaced by a new National Defence doctrine, focused on the defence of Australia in the face of potential threats in our region.
It is a significant departure because of the seriousness of the threat from a country that starts with C and ends with A. A couple of thousand range missile takes you well into the South China Sea. In a nuclear submarine submerged in the deep water trench to the east of the Philippines, just speaking theoretically, you understand, you could cover the whole of the Taiwan Straits.
But some critics say, if anything, the review takes us back towards a defence of the Australian mainland posture.
The submarine announcement, the whole AUKUS concept, very much embodied the idea that Australia's principal strategic priority was to support the United States in resisting China's challenge to the US-led order in Asia. And I think there are very big problems with that, but at least it was a clear approach. In this document, you get some of that, but you also get a whole lot of stuff which sounds very much like the DIB review. It talks very much about the defence of Australia.
The review is also not just about missiles or about a shift in the jobs of the Army, Air Force and Navy. The review talks about the need for statecraft, that is, more diplomacy in the region, but also changes in areas like foreign investment laws and critical infrastructure. Climate change will be an important issue for our defence forces to work with. The review warns recent floods have shown the impact that climate change can have on civilian infrastructure that is crucial to national security, like roads and bridges. It's all going to require a whole-of-nation effort, the review says, and between now and next month's budget, we may get a clearer idea of what its whole-of-nation cost is likely to be.
I spoke to Defence Minister Richard Marles earlier. Richard Marles, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks, Sarah.
China has been identified as a strategic threat in this review. Is there a message to Beijing in Australia's new defence posture?
Our posture is about the collective security of our region. And as we have retasked the mission of the Australian Defence Force for the first time in 35 years, central to that task is about, with our partners, providing for the collective security of our region and the maintenance of the global rules-based order. And we say that because the defence of Australia doesn't really mean much unless we have the collective security of the region in which we live, because so much harm can be done to Australia before you ever put a foot upon our shores.
What about the fact that we are preparing to meet a threat far beyond the Australian mainland? That's a clear message, isn't it?
But it's as much, Sarah, as anything to do with the change in who we are. We are a trading nation who is engaged in much more trade now than we were doing 30 years ago when Paul did his exercise in articulating our nation's strategic posture. And therefore the connection with the world, which has been really good for Australia's prosperity and our standard of living, obviously though has a strategic implication. Now, we do observe that we are witnessing the biggest conventional military build-up that we've seen in the world since the end of the Second World War. It's true that that is China. And that is part of the landscape in which we live, and it forms part of the assessment that we make about what we need to do to make ourselves self-reliant in our strategic posture. But it's far from the only factor here, and fundamentally what we're about is providing for the collective security of our region.
Let's talk about some of the changes being proposed. The role of the Army in particular is being reimagined, including more landing craft, fewer armoured infantry vehicles. What kind of scenarios are you preparing for?
Well, I think reimagining is a good word. We are looking at reshaping the Army, indeed the whole Defence Force, but particularly the Army, and thinking much more in terms of projection, impactful projection, and that means that we are giving the Army a much greater ability to engage in longer range strike, further, missiles that go further, as well as being able, as you've described, to enable Army to operate in a more littoral environment. And that means having landing craft that can move our Army around.
The review recommends accelerating the acquisition of landing craft. Now, these transport troops to conflict zones beyond the Australian mainland. Where would they be deployed?
Well, again, it's about being able to have an ability to project in order to provide for the collective security of our region. And having transport that goes with the armoured vehicles that you possess is really important. And that's why we're talking about accelerating, as you've said, those landing craft. But at the same time, looking at reducing in scope the number of armoured vehicles that we are producing for our army, because we're thinking about it in the context of making sure that we have an army which is much more mobile.
Let's just talk a little bit more about deployment in the region. I mean, how far could this newly mobile army be sent?
Well, again, the way in which we are thinking about it is the collective security of the Indo-Pacific. That's the stated mission of the ADF as it's now been recast in the defence statement that we have released today. And so the Indo-Pacific is the broadest answer to the question that you've asked. We need to have a capability of making sure that we have an ability to provide for the collective security of our region, and therefore an ability to project throughout the entirety of that region.
What about Taiwan then? Can you say categorically that Australian troops would not be put on the ground in Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion?
Well, look, there's a lot of conjecture about Taiwan, and I'm not about to add to that conjecture now. I mean, any future scenario in Taiwan is going to be a matter for a future government to consider on its own terms. Right now, in 2023, our position in respect of Taiwan is really clear.
What makes you think that a question over Taiwan would necessarily fall into the decision-making capacity of another government?
Well, all I'm saying is that it would be for the government of the time in the future, whichever government that is, and if it's our government, then it's our government. But my point really is that it's for a government at that moment in time to assess the circumstances of any conflict that Australia may or may not get involved with. But what I'm really pointing out is I'm not about to engage in conjecture now about hypothetical scenarios in the future. Right now in 2023, our position on Taiwan is really clear, and that is that we don't support any unilateral change in the status quo which exists across the Taiwan Straits.
The review recommends acquiring a new suite of long-range missiles. How far would the reach of these missiles be?
Well, right now, we have an ability to send ordnance about 40 kilometres in distance. What we're now talking about is acquiring a capability in the medium term, being able to do that, to project over 300 kilometres and potentially over 500 and beyond going into the future. But the real point here is that we need to extend that projection. We need to extend the range of strike that we have. I mean, that's fundamental to the idea of projection.
Now, it's American companies who will build the assembly plants. Do you have a commitment from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, the big US defence contractors, that they will transfer the IP, that they will transfer their technology to Australia?
Look, it's a good question, and obviously we're working closely with both Raytheon and Lockheed. And at the heart of your question also is the importance of being able to develop a manufacturing capability in Australia for these missiles and for these munitions, and that forms part of the focus of what we are, one of the focus priorities that we are pursuing in response to the DSR.
That's the Defence
question of
Review.
Sorry, the Defence Strategic Review. You're right to pick me up on that. The question of export controls coming out of the United States in relation to defence technology, one can understand why those controls exist, but if we are going to move forward in a way which sees a much quicker development of this, then we really do need to be working with the United States to lower those barriers and have a much more seamless defence industrial base between our two countries. In other words, a situation where we are much more willing to share information and technology between our two industrial bases. Now, I think at the highest level there is an acceptance of that idea in the United States. Not for a moment am I suggesting that all the work's done in getting getting to a point where there is that seamless defence industrial base, but we desperately need to get there, and this is a real priority in terms of the work that we'll be doing with the US government around defence policy going
And just
forward.
briefly on this, America hasn't fought a war against a comparable power for an extremely long time. They don't have the stockpiles currently for such a conflict. Are you concerned that Australia would become a secondary supply source for the US military in the event of war?
Well, I think the way I'd answer that is that what we've seen with the war in Ukraine is that the stockpiles of munitions and ordnance and missiles amongst our friends and allies is not where we need it to be. We have this has an impact on Australia in terms of our own war stocks, and so in that sense, in order for us to be able to get the supplies that we need, we're clearly going to need to make a contribution to the net industrial base of both countries and indeed other friends and allies, and that's why it's so important that we are engaging in the manufacture of munitions here in Australia, and we will obviously be doing that very closely with the United States. We are working to be close enough to have an interchangeability of missiles between our two defence forces, and that's what will give rise to the maximising of Australian capability.
Richard Marles, thank you very much indeed for joining us.